Think 47 tons of armor is a guarantee of survival? Think again. That vaunted steel becomes your executioner when white-hot spall shears off the interior under the impact of enemy slugs. 5 dead men walking traded their sanity in a 120-degree oven to stop a panzer wedge single-handedly. But the real nightmare began when the shooting stopped. How the crew and the machine itself dealt with that invincible beast in the end isn't something they put in the manuals. Watch until the end. The conclusion will chill you to the bone. October 1941. The air reeks of burnt rubber and TNT. The ground vibrates beneath your boots. German armored wedges are systematically tearing defensive lines to shreds. The continuous front is gone. There are only pockets of resistance, drowning in their own blood. A crimson glow pulses on the western horizon. The thunder of heavy artillery impacts sounds like a steady, monotonous hum. German Panzer Division HQ. Dry, warm. General Meyer stands over a map spread across the table. Nearby lie stacks of radiograms from forward unit commanders. An adjutant reads reports of resistance from unknown Russian heavy tanks. The officers are on edge. Meyer smirks, adjusting his monocle. He takes the reports and tosses them carelessly onto the table. The general considers the data nothing more than foolish panic. Infantry are always afraid of steel silhouettes in the fog. The Wehrmacht armada is fueled and ready. The order is signed. Ahead lies only the lightning dash to Moscow. Logistics are running like clockwork. The German machine does not tolerate stops. On the other side of the front, logistics are measured in lives. A damp, cold command post bunker. Dry dirt shakes loose from the ceiling with every nearby impact. The dim flame of a lamp catches 2 faces in the gloom. Faces gray from sleep deprivation and trench grime. The battalion commander crushes his cigarette butt against a shell casing. Standing motionless across from him is Lieutenant Savelyev. Savelyev knows his grim trade inside and out. He understands what it means to hold the line. He is a career professional for whom war has lost every shred of romance. An unnamed height, a crossroads of 2 dirt tracks, the commander says, tapping the dull end of a pencil against a worn map. The Germans will push through right here. Otherwise, they can't bypass the marshes. There is absolutely no one else to meet them. Our strength? Saveliyev's voice is hollow. Your tank, alone. I can't give you any infantry. A heavy silence hangs in the bunker. Another shell lands close by, making the flame flicker. This isn't an order to win a fair fight. It's a cold death sentence. An order to die on a designated line, taking as many of the enemy with you as possible. Savelyev nods silently. He calmly accepts this one-way ticket. Heroism here is devoid of pretty words. It is simply the perfected automation of professionals performing an impossible task. War is a dirty job where the price of a mistake is instant non-existence. Savelyev steps out into the trench. The autumn wind lashes his face with icy drizzle. In the hollow, hidden under camo netting, his tank stands silent. A KV-1 heavy tank, 47 tons of cast armor steel. The Soviet School of Tank Design built these steel monsters for exactly this kind of merciless war. A tank isn't just a vehicle. It's a massive, white-hot furnace where human character is forged daily. Victory and defeat obey strict physical laws. The arithmetic of death is cold and concrete. The German 50mm gun has excellent ballistics, but from a range of 300 meters, its armor-piercing shell is physically incapable of penetrating the 75mm of monolithic frontal armor on a heavy tank. This is a direct collision of kinetic energy and the molecular bonds of metal. A true duel between a steel sledgehammer and a concrete wall. Inside the cramped fighting compartment, conditions are always pushed to the limits of human endurance. In combat, the air temperature quickly rises to 100, sometimes 120 degrees Fahrenheit. A crew of 5 is bolted inside a tight steel box. Packed in with them are 114 heavy fixed rounds. Each shell weighs over 35 pounds. They must be hauled out of the racks and slammed into the breech with bare hands. The stagnant air is thick with heavy carbon monoxide and fine metallic dust that shreds the lungs. The men inside the machine are merely living mechanisms, ensuring its combat readiness. The driver grips the steering levers tight. The gunner's bloodshot eyes are glued to the optics. The loader works his back muscles to exhaustion. The radio operator listens intently to the static on the airwaves. The commander continuously assesses the situation. Each has a clear, distinct function. Primal fear vanishes once the grueling physical labor begins. All that remains is a ringing void in the head and honed combat reflexes. Physiology always triumphs over emotion. Lieutenant Savliev walks slowly toward the steel tracks. The cold metal of the treads is caked in a thick layer of sticky mud. Soon, this metal will be violently tearing up the earth. The German column is already warming up its engines. The arrogant General Meyer anticipates a cakewalk. The enemy doesn't know yet that the relentless math of their offensive is about to collide with the impenetrable geometry of the defense. "Mount up!" Savliev barks, a short, sharp command to his crew. The massive diesel engine heaves and spits out a thick cloud of blue-gray smoke. The motor roars under the strain. 47 tons of cold metal lurch forward with a loud clatter. The tank crawls heavily ahead. The site of the future fire mission requires preparation. Preparation requires back-breaking physical labor. Survival in war isn't about luck. It's about how much dirt you move and how fast you can load the gun. The crew of the heavy tank under Lieutenant Saveliev's command has been through the meat grinder of a weeks-long retreat. They've seen their comrades burn alive and seen armor shatter from direct hits by heavy artillery. This horrific experience has burned away everything unnecessary from their souls. Now they work in silence, frantically hacking into the dense, stubborn autumn clay with heavy entrenching tools. 47 tons of metal must be securely hidden. The tank has to blend into the landscape, becoming an invisible element of the terrain. Saveliev's engineering calculations are brutal, pragmatic, and precise. The position is chosen on the reverse slope of an inconspicuous hill overlooking the fork of 2 battered dirt roads. The gun barrel is aimed exactly at the geometric center of the future kill zone. The distance to the target is perfect for a point-blank shot. "Dig deeper. The left track is sticking out over the berm," the commander rasps, tossing aside a tunic soaked in cold sweat. The October air cuts his lungs like ice shards, but thick steam rises from the men's backs. "We hit rock, Lieutenant. It's bending the shovel into a horseshoe," the driver replies, his breathing heavy and wheezing. His broad palms are covered in burst, bleeding blisters. Mud mixes with blood on the handle. "Claw it out with your teeth. We're dead if we don't hide. We still have to lay the camo." The dull thud of steel against stone monotonically counts down the seconds slipping away. The earth is viscous and heavy, soaked through by lingering autumn rains. Every clump of wet clay thrown over the berm is a moment reclaimed from oblivion. The tankers are digging a deep, hull-down pit by hand, a massive rectangular trench where the war machine will be lowered up to its turret. The man-made cover will completely hide the vulnerable high hull, leaving only the incredibly thick frontal armor of the rounded turret and the long snout of the 76mm gun above the surface. Meters of packed earth will become their additional, impenetrable shield. In the distance, beyond the edge of the blackened forest, the low, vibrating hum of a cannonade grows steadily. Enemy artillery is systematically plowing through rear communications, square by square. The front line is closing in relentlessly, rolling forward like a solid wall of lead. The tremor in the soil is now clearly felt through the stiff soles of their boots. Savelyev doesn't give his exhausted crew a single minute of rest. As soon as the muddy shovels are tossed aside, they immediately begin drilling actions honed to the point of reflex. Inside the cramped, frozen fighting compartment, a dry, merciless training session unfolds. The loader is on his bruised knees on the diamond plate floor. His sole task is to permanently turn his arms into the pistons of a fail-safe feeding mechanism. AP! Savelyev snaps. The sharp metallic clank of the sliding block breech. A heavy, long, fixed round weighing 36 pounds is ripped from the canvas loops of the ammo rack. The muscles in his back and forearms tighten like steel cables. The dull thud of the brass casing's rim against the breech. The sharp slam of the closing block. He! Another frantic lurch. Another strike of metal on metal. The young loader's fingers are bloodied from the rough burrs of the ammo crates, but the pace doesn't drop for a fraction of a second. 4 seconds to load. 3 seconds. In a real firefight, this mechanical speed will decide who turns into a smoldering bonfire of human meat and who keeps breathing. The physics of survival are elementary. You must fire much faster than a trained opponent can traverse his turret and put his optics on your silhouette. The gunner's face is glued to the rubber eyepiece of the telescopic sight. Over and over, he cold-bloodedly catches landmarks on the muddy dirt road in his crosshairs. A lone dry birch, a sharp bend in the rutted track, the abandoned frame of a peasant cart. Every distance is meticulously measured to the meter. The horizontal and vertical laying angles are calculated with mathematical perfection. This isn't the high art of sniping. It's the applied engineering of mass destruction. The strict geometry of a trap where the variable of chance has been completely removed from the formula. When the earthworks are finished, the heavy machine, with the straining, roaring howl of its diesel engine, slowly backs into the dugout trench. The wide steel tracks press deep into the fresh clay. The engine abruptly cuts out. A terrifying, ringing silence instantly drops over the position, broken only by the distant but ever-growing drone of hundreds of enemy engines. The camouflage phase begins. The exhausted crew silently cuts branches from thick fir trees, hauls heavy armfuls of withered tall grass, and plasters the green armor of the turret with clumps of mud and sod. The tankers carefully mask the contours of the combat vehicle so that the sharp geometric lines of the cut steel plates dissolve completely into the chaos of the autumn undergrowth. The heavy tank physically vanishes. It merges organically with the damp earth, becoming a natural, inseparable extension of the hill. The cooling, thick armor is quickly covered in beads of cold condensation. Savelyev walks 40 paces down toward the road and scrutinizes the prepared position with extreme care. Where 47 tons of lethal, coiled fury just hunkered down, there is only an uneven mound of brush and an old fallen tree. The optical illusion is flawless. The kill zone is set. The engineering task is complete. "Work's done," the commander says hoarsely, tossing the last fir branch into the deep trench. "Everyone inside." Button up. We wait. The heavy steel turret hatches slam shut over the heads of the 5 tankers with a deafening, hollow thud. The crew is completely cut off from the outside world. All that remains is the thick, stagnant smell of spilled diesel, gun grease, and sour human sweat. Inside the cramped, sealed steel capsule, relentless time begins to slow its pace. Waiting for the encroaching armada, turns into a sophisticated psychological torture, where every second presses on the brain with the weight of lead. This grueling silence stretches the nerves like a vibrating wire. This grueling silence stretches the nerves like a vibrating wire. War is 90% the agonizing wait for death, and only 10% death itself. Inside the belly of the heavy Soviet tank, seconds turn into a physically tangible wait. The breathing of 5 men in the cramped, bolted-shut space seems deafening. Oxygen is catastrophically low. The stagnant air is thick with the acrid smell of gun grease, spilled diesel, heated metal, and old, sour sweat. The driver's calloused hands are locked onto the steel steering levers. His white knuckles are cramping from the continuous muscular tension. Large, salty drops roll down the gunner's soot-stained forehead. They sting his eyes unbearably, but the tanker doesn't dare pull his gaze away from the rubber rim of the optical sight. Every beat of his own heart echoes in his temples like a dull, monotonous hammer blow. The human psyche isn't built for this kind of strain. Absolute stillness suppresses the human will far more effectively than shrapnel. The brain, deprived of its usual external stimuli, begins to generate phantom noises, causing reflexive flinches at every rustle of dry earth crumbling at the edges of the pit. But the rigid discipline of the body shackles the panic of the mind. The crew merges with the machine, turning into a tightly coiled mechanism awaiting the inevitable pull of the trigger. The loader sits frozen, his hands clamped around a heavy armor-piercing shell, ready at any split second to hurl it into the open maw of the breach. Through the narrow slits of the commander's cupola periscopes, Lieutenant Savelyev coldly watches as the gray morning mist over the dirt road begins to slowly drift apart, revealing the rutted landscape. The earth transmits a rhythmic, steadily growing tremor. First, a low, visceral drone of many high-performance gasoline engines hangs in the air. Then, through the milky veil, sharp, predatory silhouettes emerge. The German tank column moves in a tight march formation, absolutely confident in its overwhelming power. The lead vehicle, a German Panzer III, is commanded by the veteran First Lieutenant Schroeder. His company has dozens of destroyed Soviet tanks and hundreds of kilometers of successful advance to its credit. The German tankers ride confidently with their hatches open, breathing in the cool October air. Their cocky carelessness is firmly grounded in the logic of past battles. According to morning intel, the Russians have nothing left in this sector capable of putting up organized resistance, only scattered, decimated infantry groups. The range is closing fast. 700 meters. 500 meters. The dry clatter of steel tracks against small stones completely drowns out the sounds of the forest. The long barrels of the German 50mm guns sway rhythmically with the movement, staring blindly ahead. The armada rolls as a heavy mass of steel directly into the geometric center of the kill zone, calculated with flawless mathematical precision by the Soviet lieutenant. Inside the earthen ambush, the tension reaches a critical peak. The distance closes to 400 meters. The gunner swallows a dry lump in his parched throat. His index finger rests firmly on the metal trigger. "Take the shot?" he asks hoarsely, on a sharp exhale, without taking his strained, reddened eye from the crosshairs. "Hold!" Savliev's voice sounds with icy calm, steady and heavy, like the clank of a closing breach. "Let them get point blank." This is composure balancing on the very edge of a physical breakdown. Savliev's engineering calculation is based on ensuring maximum kinetic penetration and creating instant psychological paralysis in the enemy. If they strike now, from a safe distance, the trailing German tanks will have time to quickly disperse to the flanks and escape direct fire. Tactics dictate a brutal condition. The column must be pulled completely into the narrow bottleneck of the muddy road, pinned between an impassable bog on one side and the steep slope of the hill on the other. 300 meters, 250 meters. Through the high-grade optics of the sight, the relaxed faces of the German commanders peering out of their turrets are already crystal clear. The white crosses on the dark gray armor are distinct. The clumpy mud stuck to the spare tracks is visible. The crew's heartbeats involuntarily synchronize with the heavy throb of the foreign engines. The heavy tank is frozen, a lifeless mound thick with withered fir needles. 200 meters. 150 meters. The lead German tank crosses the invisible, fatal line of sight, drawing level with the lone, dry birch chosen in advance as the primary landmark. The point of no return is passed. The range is perfect. AP, on the lead. Fire! Savliev's short, clipped command ruthlessly shatters the oppressive silence of the cramped compartment. The gunner slams the pedal down with the force of his entire body. The 76mm rifled gun bellows, spitting a massive plume of blinding yellow flame into the air. The monstrous roar of the shot instantly displaces the remaining oxygen in the fighting compartment, striking the tanker's eardrums with the force of a sledgehammer. The 47-ton machine recoils violently, its wide tracks biting even deeper into the damp soil. The blunt-nosed, armor-piercing shell, weighing over 13 pounds and propelled by powder gases to a velocity of over 2,100 feet per second, crosses the gap between the machines in a fraction of a second. Direct hit. The kinetic energy of the heavy alloy slug punches through the frontal armor of the lead German tank with a terrifying metallic crunch. The shell shears through the rolled steel and detonates with a deafening crack deep inside the enemy fighting compartment. Schroeder's turret, along with the commander's cupola, is instantly blown clean off the ring and lands in a deep roadside ditch with a long, horrific metallic crash. A massive pillar of roaring flame and thick, oily black smoke erupts from the shredded steel hull high into the autumn sky. The hours of grueling, static waiting are instantly shattered. The ruthless, methodical assembly line of destruction begins. The ruthless, methodical assembly line of destruction begins. War does not tolerate pauses. It feeds on the speed of human reflexes. The destruction of the lead vehicle paralyzes the Wehrmacht column for only a few short seconds. But in Lieutenant Savyelyev's optics, those seconds stretch into a long, viscous eternity. Time loses its usual flow. Fire from the mangled German tank greedily licks the autumn air. The drivers following behind instinctively slam on the brakes. Heavy steel tracks skid and screech against the wet mud, gouging deep furrows. The column bunches up like an accordion, slamming into its own tail. A perfect target. The kill zone is pulled tight. "Take out the tail! AP!" Savyelyev rasps over the ringing in his ears. Inside the Soviet heavy tank, a localized hell unfolds. The cramped space of the fighting compartment is instantly filled with acrid blue powder smoke. The weak turret fan is completely unable to handle such a concentration of gas. Carbon monoxide stings the lungs and burns the eyes to tears. The temperature climbs in leaps and bounds. The tank is rapidly turning into a searing steel oven. The loader is working beyond the limits of human capability. His sole task is to feed the gun without stopping. The fixed round weighs 36 pounds. He has to pull them from the floor racks, turn in the unthinkable tightness, and accurately ram them into the breech. The slightest loss of concentration, and fingers severed by the heavy sliding block, will be left on the diamond plate metal forever. The muscles in his back and shoulders burn with unbearable fire. The blisters on his palms have long since burst. The brass of the casings, slick with fresh blood and sweat, mercilessly tears his skin. Ready? Fire! Another jolt of monstrous force slams the crew into their hard seats. The 76mm gun spits death. Range, 250 meters. At such short distance, the 30mm rear armor of a medium tank is just a sheet of thin cardboard for a heavy Soviet AP shell. The alloy slug punches through the engine compartment of the tail vehicle. Kinetic energy shreds the engine to pieces. The fuel tanks detonate instantly. A bright, blinding flash tears through the gray mist. Now the German column is pinned at both ends by white-hot, burning wrecks. There is no way back. To the right is the steep slope of the hill. To the left, an impassable, viscous bog. The trap has snapped shut for good. Heroism isn't about poster-worthy shouts or noble poses. Heroism is monotonous, back-breaking, bloody labor in a vacuum of oxygen. The loader has finally turned into a soulless mechanism of a feeding conveyor. Bend, heave, the crushing weight in his hands, the clank of the breech. 36 pounds. Another 36 pounds. He no longer feels physical pain. Primal fear left with the first shot. All that remains is the ringing void in his head and reflexes hammered in by training. Sweat pours down his face in a steady stream. There is absolutely nothing to breathe. His chest heaves violently. Every gasping breath brings only a dose of toxic gas and red-hot metallic dust. He! On the infantry! Fire! The machinery of mass destruction operates with seamless precision. A high-explosive fragmentation shell screams from the rifled bore, slamming into a dense cluster of German infantrymen scrambling in panic from the decks of the surviving tanks. A massive explosion ruthlessly scatters torn bodies across the withered autumn grass. Soft human flesh is powerless against jagged shards of cast iron flying at the speed of sound. Primal chaos erupts on the battered dirt road as Wehrmacht soldiers bolt aimlessly through thick black smoke. The massive gun barrel is heated to its thermal limit. The protective green paint on the breech begins to bubble and blacken, emitting a sickening chemical stench. The gunner cranks the heavy traverse and elevation handwheels with frantic urgency, his face completely masked by settled soot. The reticle of the optical sight dances methodically, dispassionately, from one white cross to the next. "Armor piercing! Third in the column!" Savelyev barks. His voice is stripped of all human inflection, reduced to the dry fixation of a target. A flash. The heavy recoil of the gun hisses past the gunner's face, missing him by millimeters. The extractor ejects the spent casing with a metallic clang. It thuds onto the steel floor, adding searing heat to the cramped box. The third German tank takes a devastating hit to the flank. The solid shot punches through the plate, shredding the crew with internal spall. Victory isn't forged in headquarters. It is forged right here, in sticky sweat and blood. 47 tons of Soviet steel vomit death. The battle is won through the frantic endurance of muscle. The loader, his breath a ragged wheeze, rams home another shell. The tempo is that of a machine gun. German armor burns with an inevitable searing heat as thick, greasy smoke pours from ruptured turrets. But the enemy is no faceless gray mass. These are superbly trained, experienced soldiers who have marched across half of Europe. The panic of the first seconds begins to fade. German officers restore control over the surviving crews with harsh orders. Short, barking radio commands re-establish combat discipline. The optics of German gunners feverishly scan the tree line. The turrets of the surviving medium tanks begin to traverse in sync, inexorably turning toward the camouflaged hill, hunting for the source of the fire, destroying them. The shock of the ambush passes, giving way to the brutal necessity of survival. A distinct premonition of an inevitable counterstrike hangs in the air, where soft human flesh will be replaced by the ruthless language of heavy artillery and steel. The merciless dialect of heavy steel and high explosives descends upon the hill in a continuous barrage. Experienced German gunners instantly spot the bright muzzle flashes. The turrets of the surviving tanks halt in unison, locking onto the target. The column bristles with the stubby barrels of 50mm guns. The enemy has recovered. A second of paralysis is replaced by the cold, methodical rage of professionals. A dense, focused hail of armor-piercing shells rains down on Lieutenant Saveliev's position. The first hit connects with a deafening, nauseating ring. A blunt-nosed steel slug, flying at over 600 meters per second, slams into the 75mm frontal armor of the turret. The shell fails to penetrate the thick Soviet metal. A monstrous amount of kinetic energy is deflected into a ricochet, kicking up a spray of blinding white sparks. The carefully arranged camouflage of fir branches and sod is instantly blown to shreds, exposing the dark green silhouette of the machine. The tank is no longer a ghost. It is now an open, clear target for dozens of enemy barrels. The strikes follow one after another, merging into a continuous, unbearable roar. Inside the cramped fighting compartment, every impact of an enemy shell feels like the blow of a colossal sledgehammer against a massive cast-iron bell. The overpressure hammers their eardrums. A ringing vibration permeates the 47-ton mass, transmitting through the floor and hard seats directly into the tanker's internal organs. The crew is on the verge of severe concussion. Dark blood begins to ooze from the men's noses and ears. A red haze clouds their vision. Blood smears the sights, mixing with acrid powder residue and sticky sweat. The physics of armor plating have their own ruthless laws. On the outside, the metal holds the blow, but inside, a hidden catastrophe unfolds. Under the continuous, brutal impact of high-velocity kinetic slugs, the inner surface of the armor begins to scab. Razor-sharp, red-hot shards of sheared steel shriek through the cramped space of the turret. This is an internal spall field, deadly shrapnel born from their own protection. The driver mechanic lets out a raspy cry, his hands never loosening their grip on the steel levers. Fine, hot grit sprays across his face like a fan. Blood floods his eyes, streaming down sunken cheeks onto a filthy tunic. Pain stabs through his body, but he cannot let go of the controls. The machine must remain a stable platform for accurate fire. The tanker merely jerks his head convulsively, wiping the bloody veil away with his shoulder, and continues to hold his course. In this enclosed space, there is absolutely no room for self-pity. The men inside are bleeding out, losing their orientation in the horrific din, but they do not leave the fight. Left! Reference point. Birch tree. Armor piercing. Savelyev shreds his vocal cords, trying to scream over the hellish cacophony of metal hammering against armor. He stands in the commander's cupola, pressed against the periscopes. His face has become a frozen mask. High explosive shells burst continuously around them, showering the tank with a heavy hail of earth and stone. Armor-piercing slugs continue to pound the front and cheeks of the turret, leaving deep, white-hot gouges. The Soviet tank is intact. The armor is performing its primary job with honor. But can the living, breathing humans inside this steel box endure this inhuman rhythm? The loader works like a machine, with its governor bypassed. Every sharp movement causes unbearable pain. A continuous, high-pitched, piercing ring fills his ears. His fingers are beaten into a bloody pulp. He grabs another 16-kilogram shell, gasping for air in the thick carbon monoxide. His lungs burn. A movement, a shove, the clang of the heavy wedge breech. "Fire!" the gunner screams, blinking thick blood from his eyelashes. The 76mm gun belches roaring flame once more, drowning out the sound of enemy hits. The return shell flies true. Another German tank, attempting to bypass the burning wrecks along the edge of a stagnant marsh, takes a fatal hit to the flank. The turret is blown off its ring. The ammunition load inside flashes blindingly. Savelyev, with the cold calculation of an engineer, continues to incinerate the machines trapped in the kill zone. The duel of total attrition reaches its absolute peak. The enemy feverishly attempts to exploit their numerical superiority. The remaining German machines maneuver, trying to find a blind spot or flank the camouflaged fire position. But the steep slope of the hill and the boggy marsh leave them no room. The road has turned into a narrow corridor of death, choked with twisted, blazing metal. The German infantry, having recovered, tries to crawl closer with grenades, digging deep into the muddy ruts. "Infantry left! Fragmentation!" the commander rasps. The loader, working by touch in the gloom, pulls a shell with black markings from the rack. He rams it into the breech, leaving slippery, bloody fingerprints on the brass. The breech clangs shut. The shot shatters eardrums. The high-explosive shell detonates in the thick of the prone soldiers, mixing gray greatcoats with autumn mud. Blind survival instinct merges with the cold geometry of battle. The armor of the Kliment Voroshilov takes dozens of lethal blows. The impenetrable shell saves lives, but extracts a terrible price. The designers built phenomenal strength into this metal, but living tissue does not possess the properties of rolled steel. The tankers' bodies are running on empty, burning through the last reserves of adrenaline. Vision tunnels, leaving only the narrow strip of the sight. The battle enters a phase of absolute mechanical exhaustion. Savelyev continues to dictate coordinates, his voice sounding monotonous, like a metronome. The gun strikes back without pause. Another German machine erupts into a bright torch. The iron sledgehammer of German artillery continues to pound furiously against the concrete wall of Soviet armor, but the wall stands to the death. The collapse of the enemy's illusions becomes absolutely inevitable. The collapse of the enemy's illusions becomes absolutely inevitable. It always comes suddenly, breaking flawless staff schedules with the dry snap of tearing paper. In the deep, securely protected and well-lit bunker of the German command, it smells of fresh, hot coffee, the expensive leather of officers' boots, and high-quality tobacco. General Meyer contentedly smooths the creases of his impeccable wool tunic. He calmly awaits the routine radio report from Oberleutnant Schröder regarding the lead tank companies breaking into operational space beyond the Soviet defensive line. The austere hands of the heavy wall clock inexorably count down the minutes of the planned triumph. Signal officers smoke lazily, talking in a relaxed manner by the bulky panels of powerful radio stations. The Wehrmacht's logistical engine is accustomed to running like clockwork. On the large tactical map, the road through the nameless height is already marked with a thick blue pencil as a final, completed stage of the great offensive. But from the wide speakers of the main radio station, instead of the Oberleutnant's clear, confident report, a dense burst of static suddenly erupts. Through this noise, a primal, unbridled human terror breaks through. The airwaves literally explode with a cacophony of death rattles, the horrific screech of tearing metal, and deafening artillery blasts. "Attention! We are in a death trap! Schröder is killed! His machine has been blown to pieces! The voice of an unknown German tank commander breaks into a high falsetto, distorted beyond recognition by wild panic. The Russians have deployed a heavy monster. Our shells are just bouncing off its armor. We are burning alive. We cannot maneuver. Fall back. Save yourselves. The radio operator in Meyer's staff bunker frantically twists the ribbed frequency knobs, desperately trying to catch a clear signal, but the airwaves are hopelessly clogged with nothing but the sounds of a mass, bloody slaughter. One can clearly hear, somewhere in the background, the hysterical screams of a driver mechanic trapped with his crew in a burning medium tank. The dull, monstrously heavy thuds of armor-piercing slugs methodically smashing through vaunted Krupp steel are audible. The triumphant expectation of an easy victory in the warm headquarters evaporates instantly, replaced by a chilling physical numbness. The general's fingers slacken, and his porcelain cup slips from his grasp. The expensive drink spreads across the clean parquet in a dirty, shapeless puddle. The German armored blitzkrieg has choked hideously on its own blood at a nameless, muddy crossroads of two waterlogged forest roads. The parallel reality of this brutal battle looks entirely different. Inside the concealed Soviet heavy tank, there is absolutely no room for panic. But there is no joyful triumph here either. A deafening, ringing silence reigns, broken only by the wheezing, heavy, strained breathing of 5 utterly exhausted men. Lieutenant Savelyiev's radio operator, through the thick cushions of his headphones, also hears the snatches of the panicked German radio traffic. He stares silently at the commander, with eyes that are bloodshot and watering from the acrid powder smoke. The crew is on the very edge of total physiological collapse. From noses broken by microscopic spall, dark trickles flow slowly, mixing with thick black soot on sunken cheeks. The young loader's hands hang listlessly along his wet body, his calloused fingers locked in a brutal muscle cramp. He can no longer even clench a fist. The steel floor of the cramped fighting compartment is thickly carpeted with dozens of spent brass casings. They sear through rugged boots, turning the enclosed space into a red-hot steel furnace. With great effort, Savelyev pulls his face, scarred by internal armor spall, away from the rubber brow pad of the commander's periscope. He swallows hard against the dry lump in his parched throat. His order has been executed with mathematical precision. The impenetrable steel barrier worked flawlessly. The view through the thick triplex glass reveals a scene of absolute, uncompromising destruction. The strict geometry of the trap worked with perfect, cold cruelty. The narrow dirt road is now packed, shoulder to shoulder, with the twisted, fiercely burning hulks of German combat vehicles. Black, oily, unnaturally thick smoke from burning diesel rises in massive columns high into the autumn sky, completely obscuring the pale disk of the grey sun. The wide tracks of treads torn apart by explosions lie in the deep mud like slaughtered steel serpents. The armor of the vaunted enemy tanks has been peeled open by kinetic strikes like cheap tin cans. Inside these blazing steel boxes, unspent ammunition loads detonate continuously, with dull pops and howls, spewing massive fountains of blinding white sparks and chunks of red-hot metal into the cool air. Ruthless fire devours first-class machinery and human bodies with the same terrifying indifference. The heat from the burning column is so intense that even through the narrow vision slits of the Soviet tank, a wave of dry, scorching air is clearly felt on the tankers' faces. The German infantry, having completely lost their armored cover and officer leadership, retreats in wild panic. Wehrmacht soldiers abandon their heavy weapons and screaming wounded, sinking deep into the cold, marshy sludge with their heavy, hobnailed boots. Their vaunted tactical order is broken forever. Their perfect offensive schedule has been ruthlessly trampled by heavy Soviet tracks. A single tank, dug into the damp earth up to its turret, has completely paralyzed the advance of an entire armored strike group. 47 tons of first-class Soviet steel withstood an unthinkable, beyond-limit blow. Enemy armor-piercing shells left dozens of deep, melt-rimmed craters on the thick turret armor. They completely sheared away the carefully laid camouflage and smashed the external toolboxes to splinters, but they failed to penetrate the most important thing: the inner citadel housing the living men. However, the men inside the scorching machine paid a truly monstrous physical price for their invulnerability. Every horrific strike of a foreign tungsten carbide slug against the armor irrevocably took a piece of their health, brutally mangled their hearing, and scorched their nerve endings. The battle is over. The lethal mechanical assembly line has stopped, the heavy breech of the red-hot gun clanging shut one last time with a dry, short snap. The very adrenaline that for the last several dozen minutes had reliably kept the tankers' bodies in a state of peak, animalistic combat efficiency begins to recede. In its place, a terrifying, leaden, muscular weakness arrives, heavy and inevitable. Nerves that were taut as cables slacken. Exhausted muscles refuse to obey the brain's commands. The wild pain from numerous burns, small cuts, and horrific bruises, until this moment completely blocked by traumatic shock, crashes down upon the tanker's fading consciousness in a single, unbearable torrent. The barrage of the enemy offensive has finally choked on its own blood. Now, that fire slowly and inexorably dies down, leaving the wounded crew alone with the soul-chilling landscape of the destruction they have wrought. The landscape of destruction is visible through narrow vision slits covered in a thick layer of soot. The fire of the tank guns finally falls silent. The insane, eardrum-shattering roar of battle is slowly replaced by the heavy, viscous hissing of rapidly cooling metal and the dry, rhythmic crackle of machine gun belts cooking off in the fire. Inside the heavy Soviet tank, a dense, hollow silence hangs. This is not the tranquility of a long-awaited rest. It is the terrifying silence of a sealed tomb. The adrenaline that for the last hour had forced human muscles to contract at the limit of biological possibility is rapidly burning to ash. The blood chemistry changes, harshly demanding repayment of its debts. In place of frantic, uncontrollable energy comes a crushing, leaden fatigue. It pins the men to the ribbed floor with the force of a massive gravitational strike. The loader slowly slides down, his back scraping against the scorching wall of the turret. His large, calloused hands, covered in black soot and blood, tremble uncontrollably. He sits directly on the hot, spent brass casings, his heavy, throbbing head hanging low between his knees. Thick, dark blood from a nose broken by internal spall drips steadily onto the steel, drying instantly and leaving brown stains on the hot metal. The gunner, with immense effort, pulls his face, wet with acrid sweat, away from the rubber brow pad of the telescopic sight. His right eye is completely swollen shut by a massive purple hematoma from the constant, jarring blows of the recoiling gun. In the ears of all 5 exhausted tankers, there is a continuous, high-pitched, piercing ring. This monotonous sound of concussion completely overrides reality, isolating the crew from the outside world. Inside the tank, the temperature still hovers above 40 degrees Celsius. The ventilator hums strainedly, but is absolutely unable to clear the thick veil of carbon monoxide. They have to breathe in short, shallow gasps to avoid searing their damaged lungs. The enclosed space presses on the psyche far more intensely than the sight of the mangled bodies outside. Every square centimeter of armor is saturated with the smell of animal fear, sweat, and burnt powder. This is the specific aroma of dirty work that sinks into the pores of the skin forever, which nothing can wash away. Lieutenant Savelyev stares silently, without blinking, through the thick glass of the commander's periscope. The narrow dirt road before the nameless crossroads has finally turned into a massive, fiercely blazing open-air crematorium. Dozens of German combat vehicles have been torn into smoking pieces. These are no longer the menacing, invincible armored forces of the advancing Wehrmacht. They are merely shapeless heaps of twisted, red-hot iron. Thick, oily black smoke from burning diesel fuel blankets the low, gray October sky like a heavy shroud. The acrid, nauseating smell of melting wire insulation, scorched rubber from road wheels, and charred human flesh penetrates even through the joints of the thick armor. The outside world in the rectangle of the triplex looks like an absolute, uncompromising apocalypse created by the hands of 5 tired men. War never knows a bright triumph. It knows only the dry mathematics of survival and the crushing weight of duty fulfilled. There is absolutely no room here for joy, elation, or pride in a well-aimed shot. The killing of dozens of living people, even those who came to your land with weapons, settles onto one's shoulders like an invisible, unliftable granite slab. "Any water left?" the driver mechanic rasps. He doesn't even attempt to unclench his white-knuckled fingers, locked in a brutal muscle cramp around the steel transmission control levers. His broken voice sounds more like the dry rustle of dead leaves. "The canteen was hit by a fragment. Dry," the radio operator replies hollowly, devoid of all emotion. He slowly wipes his bloodied face, covered in a thick layer of ingrained soot, with the filthy, diesel-soaked sleeve of his drenched tunic. "Endure it. We've completed our objective on this line. But we are still alive," Savelyev lets fall. The commander's words fall into the stale, oxygen-deprived air like heavy weights. The psychological naturalism of survival has absolutely no tolerance for grand gestures. The crew of the combat vehicle feels only an almost physically tangible internal emptiness. Methodically, shot by shot, they incinerated the elite of a German panzer division. They carried out an impossible command order, but inside their souls, only a scorched, grey void remains. All that is left is a pulsing, dull ache in their temples and a primal urge to close their eyes and fall into a deep, oblivious sleep. The human psyche is not physically equipped to endure such a monstrous scale of destruction for long. Every accurately sent armor-piercing shell, every detonated enemy machine, is a terrifying boundary that a person crosses at the cost of their own sanity. The tankers sit in a scorching iron box in the middle of a field, plowed by shells and cooling corpses. They are absolutely alone in the face of an encroaching eternity. Alone in the face of this massive slaughterhouse that grinds human destinies. The powerful frontal armor honorably withstood the trial by metal, but did the fragile human tissue withstand this torture? The souls of these hardened men are now forever etched with the same deep, jagged scars and melted craters as the steel plating of their heavy tank. Not one of them will ever be the same again. They have forever stepped across that invisible line beyond which ordinary civilian life seems like nothing but an unreal shadow. They survived where survival was mathematically impossible. The realization of the horrific price of this local engagement descends like a ruthless press. The lieutenant's gaze slowly slides across the mangled landscape. The ringing silence becomes increasingly dense, increasingly grating on the nerves. Death has retreated for only one brief, deceptive moment, gathering its incredibly bountiful harvest among the twisted iron. Suddenly, a low, swelling, vibrating thrum begins to tear through the ringing in the commander's ears. This sound is definitely not coming from the churned, track-torn earth. It is borne high in the overcast, smoke-choked sky, causing the thick steel plates of the Soviet tank to shudder with a fine, anxious tremor. The autumn air outside the multi-ton machine rapidly fills with the new, piercing wail of sirens. The combat load for the 76mm gun is almost entirely spent after repelling a massive assault. Only greasy stains remain in the empty canvas stowage bins on the floor. There is absolutely nothing left to defend this blood-soaked position with. The threat instantly shifts its vector, descending upon the battered, nameless crossroads as an inevitable strike from the heavens. The strike from the heavens descends upon the battered crossroads with an air of inevitability. War is a blind pendulum that in a single heartbeat transforms an invulnerable predator into an utterly defenseless victim. The scorching barrel of the 76mm gun slumps heavily and helplessly. The ammunition is exhausted to the very last shell. Out of 114 heavy fixed rounds, not a single intact cartridge remains in the canvas bins on the ribbed floor. There are only heaps of hot, sticky, soot-covered brass casings, unbearably scalding the tanker's rugged Kurza boots. The tank is spent. 47 tons of cast-armored steel have been stripped of their lethal fangs, turning into a blind, lumbering target. The objective at this line has been achieved with clinical brutality. The German tank column has been permanently transformed into a smoking graveyard of twisted scrap metal. Continuing to hold an exposed position without armor-piercing or high-explosive shells is a pointless suicide that the harsh logic of combat regulations categorically does not forgive. "Fall back! Reverse! Give her everything she's got!" The commander barks, his voice hoarse through a hacking, lung-tearing cough. The driver-mechanic ferociously digs his bloody, cramp-locked fingers into the stubborn steel tillers. With incredible effort, using the full weight of his exhausted, bruised body, he slams the stiff gear into place. The massive V12 diesel engine roars under the strain with a metallic clang, spitting thick, oily black clouds of acrid blue smoke from the exhaust stacks. The wide steel tracks grind with a deafening screech in the deep, viscous autumn clay of the revetment. The enormous mass of metal reluctantly, millimeter by millimeter, tears its flat belly away from the damp, cold earth. With a heavy, strained groan, the tank crawls out of its life-saving cover in reverse. Every jerky movement is accompanied by the horrific clatter of overstressed treads and the agonizing howl of an overheated transmission. The machine backs slowly into the open, crater-scarred expanse. The abrupt shift in tempo and the vector of the threat hits the crew's frayed nerves harder than any large-caliber shell. The low, monotonous drone in the gray October sky rapidly escalates into a high, piercing, maddening shriek. Through the low, heavy cloud cover, choked with greasy black smoke from burning German armor, predatory, angular silhouettes dive vertically. Junkers 87 dive bombers. The German Luftwaffe always arrives with surgical precision wherever their ground blitzkrieg is choking on its own blood. The aerodynamic sirens on the plane's fixed landing gear, the Jericho trumpets, emit a horrific, unbearable sound, specifically engineered to crush the human will. This soul-chilling acoustic assault paralyzes the mind, forcing muscles to reflexively contract in the submissive expectation of instant death. The Soviet tank crew is bolted shut inside a cramped, sweltering box. They are completely blind to the vertical threat. The maximum elevation of the tank's optics physically prevents them from seeing the vertically diving bombers. The tankers can only listen with resignation as cold death plummets toward their heads. The thick frontal armor of the turret, which had confidently shrugged off direct hits from kinetic slugs, is now utterly useless. The upper armor plates of the roof and engine compartment are several times thinner. Against heavy 250-kilogram aerial bombs, the lumbering tank is as defenseless as a tin can under a blacksmith's sledgehammer. "Floor it! Get us to the woods!" the lieutenant snarls, pressing his bloodied face hard into the narrow rubber padding of the vision block. But the reverse speed is catastrophically slow. The race against death was lost before it even began. The wail of the sirens cuts off abruptly. Dark, elongated, Teardrop-shaped HE bombs detach from the black fuselages. The seconds of freefall stretch into an infinite, agonizing eternity. A monstrous explosion rips through the soft loam just a few meters from the right side of the retreating machine. A flash of blinding white light sears away the remnants of their vision for a fraction of a second. A shockwave with the density of a concrete wall slams into 47 tons of steel. The multi-ton tank is heaved violently into the air. The deafening roar instantly ruptures eardrums. Inside the fighting compartment, the men are tossed from their hard seats like rag dolls, striking the protruding iron corners of the breech, the metal ammo crates, and the steel walls of the turret with horrific force. Hot blood sprays from noses and ears. Consciousness fades under the unbearable weight of a severe concussion. The physics of destruction work relentlessly. Shrapnel from the bomb, carrying colossal kinetic energy, slices through the suspension like hot razors through soft butter. The right track snaps with a deafening, prolonged metallic ring. The multi-hundred-pound steel ribbon flies off the road wheels and sags lifelessly into a muddy puddle. The shockwave crumples the thin fenders and savagely deforms the armored grills over the engine compartment. The diesel engine chokes on its own roar, emits a horrific metallic screech of snapping crankshafts, spits a jet of boiling antifreeze, and instantly dies, seized tight. Suddenly, an absolute ringing silence falls, broken only by the loud hissing of punctured radiators and the thick, bubbling sound of motor oil leaking onto the scorching metal. The tank is completely immobilized. The driver, spitting thick gobs of blood, yanks desperately at the dead tillers, but the heavy machine shows no sign of life. In a single second, the mighty heavy tank has been transformed into a stationary, paralyzed target in the middle of an open, swept field. The storm from the heavens has passed, but it left only hollow hopelessness in its wake. The black cordite smoke from the near miss is slowly dispersed by the wind, and through the murky, crack-webbed glass of the periscopes, the commander sees a new, inevitable threat. The surviving German infantry, recovering from their initial shock, begin to rise slowly from the deep roadside ditches. Gray figures in deep helmets, submachine guns at the ready, close in on the frozen Soviet tank with short, cautious rushes. They understand perfectly well that the steel monster can no longer maneuver. They can clearly see the snapped shed track. Methodically, with the cold calculation of experienced and ruthless killers, the enemy soldiers begin to tighten a noose around the utterly vulnerable, blinded, and deafened machine. Death is no longer falling from the smoke-choked skies. It is walking slowly and surely across the shattered earth, methodically tightening its cold, filthy fingers around the throat of the wounded crew. There is no time left to save the equipment. There is no time left to save the equipment. 45 tons of secret armored steel and cutting-edge engineering are frozen fast in the sodden autumn clay. Evacuating the paralyzed multi-ton machine is absolutely impossible. The heavy track ribbon blown off by the blast and the engine compartment shattered by a direct bomb hit have delivered a final, non-appealable sentence. The heavy Soviet tank is no longer an autonomous combat unit. It has turned into a stationary, paralyzed fortress, doomed to swift and inevitable capture. The German infantry methodically tightens the encirclement with short rushes. The gray wool greatcoats of the Wehrmacht soldiers flicker among the blackened tree trunks. The distance is rapidly closing to a hand grenade's throw. Inside the sweltering turret, there is a thick, nauseating stench of spilled blood, scorched insulation, and imminent, almost tangible death. Lieutenant Savelyev coolly assesses the tactical situation and makes the only correct, albeit brutal, decision. The secret chemical composition of the cast armor and the unique ballistics of the 76mm rifled gun must under no circumstances become a research trophy for enemy engineers. This is an unshakable law of war. War never tolerates sentimentality or attachment. It always ruthlessly takes back even what just saved your life. "Abandon vehicle. Take your sidearms." Savelyev's voice sounds hollow, monotonous, devoid of emotion. "Comrade Lieutenant, we can fix her. Just give us time." The driver rasps horribly, continuously spitting thick clumps of dark blood onto the ribbed metal floor. "Execute the order. We're scuttling the tank now." This brief command severs any hope of saving the machine. The tankers, their teeth clenched to the point of cracking from sharp physical pain, begin their heavy, grueling work. Concussed, wounded, and deafened, the men slowly overcome their primal muscle weakness to pull heavy Degtyaryov submachine guns and spare drum magazines from their mounts. Fingers, beaten into a bloody pulp against the rough metal of the breech, grip the cold, blued steel of the weapons with immense effort. The crew casts brief, parting glances at the soot-stained walls of the fighting compartment, scarred by internal spall. This cramped, stifling iron box, reeking of sour sweat and burnt powder, had been their only reliable shelter. It had steadfastly absorbed dozens of lethal blows from enemy armor-piercing shells. It had reliably protected their weak human flesh with its incredibly thick shell. Now, they are obligated to destroy it with their own hands. Savelyev is the last to remain inside the fighting compartment. He abruptly pulls heavy, oily blocks of industrial explosives from a special metal box under the seat. The lieutenant's movements are extremely sparse, mathematically precise, and entirely devoid of haste. He coolly plants the dense TNT blocks deep into the metal niches where the remnants of the ammo rack lie. There are several heavy HE shells with deformed brass casings that jammed tight in the racks during the brutal shelling. Savelyev's engineering calculation is based on the effect of an instantaneous chain detonation. The explosives must tear the heavy tank apart from the inside, grind the complex mechanisms into the dirt, permanently ruin the barrel's rifling, and shatter the sophisticated optics of the telescopic sights into dust. "Hatches! Go! Go!" the commander shouts hoarsely, firmly inserting a dry metal detonator into the soft body of a TNT block. The heavy steel hatch covers swing back with a dull, prolonged clang. The cold October air, thick with the acrid black smoke of the dying German column, hits the tankers' battered faces. One by one, the men heave themselves over the high armored sides and drop down into the deep, freezing mud. Their legs absolutely refuse to hold their weight after hours of sitting in the scorching oven. The driver falls heavily to his knees, convulsively gulping life-saving oxygen into his torn lungs. The commander tightly grips a short length of fuse cord in his hand. A dry, sharp click of the mechanical igniter. A small, hissing spark begins to race down the gray cord, ruthlessly devouring the final seconds of the great war machine's life. With a powerful surge, Savelyev pulls himself up on weakened arms, rolls out of the turret onto the muddy armor, and slides to the ground. "Take cover! In the crater!" he rasps, diving headlong into the bottom of a deep hole dug by a recent German bomb blast. 5 exhausted men press themselves hard into the damp, cold earth. They cover their heads tightly with filthy hands, opening their mouths wide so the sudden atmospheric pressure spike doesn't rupture their eardrums completely. The ringing silence before an explosion always feels like the longest form of torture. The gray German infantry is already cautiously emerging into the open, training their submachine guns on the immobilized Soviet tank. The Wehrmacht soldiers don't have time to realize exactly what is happening. A monstrous explosion instantly shatters the space. It isn't just a loud bang. It is a low, guttural roar of colossal kinetic energy, bursting free from its cramped steel prison. The detonation of the planted TNT initiates the blast of the remaining heavy HE shells within fractions of a second. The internal gas pressure exceeds all conceivable strength limits of the cast armored steel in a heartbeat. 75 millimeters of monolithic, impenetrable protection snap at the seams like thin, brittle clay. The multi-ton circular turret is ripped from its geared ring with a horrific, soul-tearing metallic screech and hurled high into the leaden October sky. A massive pillar of blinding yellow flame and thick black smoke rises over the battered forest. A shockwave of incredible density sweeps over the churned earth like a solid wall. It easily knocks the advancing German soldiers off their feet, while pinning the wounded crew deep into the viscous mud of their life-saving crater. A heavy, lethal rain of red-hot armor fragments, chunks of the shattered diesel engine, and molten steel treads collapses onto the heads of the prone men with a deafening whistle. The war machine that had single-handedly halted an entire Wehrmacht tank armada has ceased to exist forever. The steel monster, forged by Soviet engineering, did not meet its end from a well-aimed enemy shell. It met its death at the hands of its own crew, taking its primary military secret to a mass grave of mixed mud and ash forever. The mangled, bleeding, and completely deafened crew slowly raise their heads from the ice-water-filled crater. Through the thick, acrid veil of settling brick dust and powder smoke, they see only a smoking hulk, torn into shapeless, twisted pieces of metal. The farewell to the steel is final. The road back is now completely cut off. Ahead lies only the deep, cold autumn forest. Ahead lie enemy infantry patrols, uncertainty, and the long, grueling trek back to friendly lines. The shell-shocked soldiers rise silently to their feet and tighten their grip on their cold, blued weapons, vanishing into the thick fog. The thick fog swallows the exhausted men. It cuts them off forever from the burning crossroads behind them. The autumn forest meets the tankers with indifferent dampness, piercing cold, step by step. The physiology of survival dictates harsh laws. The body is completely drained of life-saving adrenaline. It begins to fail rapidly. The shell-shocked soldiers trudge through the dense deadfall. They move their heavy, leaden legs with immense difficulty. Their Kirza boots sink deep into freezing puddles. Dark blood from ruptured eardrums bakes into a thick crust on their necks. Burned, bloodied hands maintain a death grip on the cold, blued steel of their heavy Degtyaryov submachine guns. Lieutenant Savelyev leads the way. He methodically plots a course by compass through the wet thickets. He leans heavily on a thick, broken branch. Every convulsive breath echoes with sharp pain in his battered ribs. War never ends with the last shot fired. It sinks deep under the skin. It poisons the blood with carbon monoxide. It permanently alters the structure of the human psyche. Heroism isn't a shiny medal on a dress uniform. It is the purely physical capacity to take one more step when the body is biologically dead. They move through the thicket, in absolute silence. Talking is impractical, dangerous. Vocal cords shredded by smoke are capable only of a dry, barking cough. The young loader periodically collapses onto the damp moss. He loses consciousness from critical blood loss and severe traumatic shock. His comrades silently hoist him up by the webbing of his mud-soaked tunic. They drag him further. This is grim, masculine work. It is devoid of even the slightest glimmer of cheap romance. The crew's mission has been reduced to a primitive function. Transport their exhausted bodies across the front line. Do not fall under the bullets of enemy infantry patrols. 2 days of continuous marching through the German rear blur into one endless gray nightmare. Hunger savagely twists their empty stomachs. The tankers quench their thirst with murky water tasting of TNT from heavy artillery craters. At night, the temperature drops below freezing. Sleeping is strictly forbidden. Stopping means instant freezing. A quiet death in one's sleep. Moving forward becomes a pure animal reflex. It is no longer controlled by the inflamed mind. On the third day, the forest abruptly ends. A muddy trench line appears ahead. The sharp challenge of an unseen sentry. The dry click of a rifle bolt. "Friendly! Tankers!" Savelyev rasps out. He falls heavily onto his worn knees before the earthen berm. "Where did you come from? There are no armored units here." A weary infantry sergeant's voice rings out. "Nameless height. The line was surrendered. We scuttled the machine." In this brief night dialogue, there is absolutely no room for tears. No grand words, no joyful embraces. There is only the dry statement of military fact. They are silently accepted into a cramped bunker. The bunker reeks of strong Majorca tobacco. They are given scalding water in aluminum mugs, hard rye crackers. No triumphant fanfares sound. No ceremonial formations are held. The front's high command is already making hurried corrections to staff maps. Generals in warm offices scrupulously analyze the reason for the inexplicable 24-hour delay of a powerful German armored wedge. Staff analysts dryly calculate the mathematical efficiency of deploying super-heavy armored vehicles in a deep ambush. Lieutenant Savelyev's tactics will inevitably transform into the sparse paragraphs of new combat regulations. The blood, sweat, and shattered nerves of 5 men are transformed into the dry ink of secret directives. These directives will bring massive strategic victories to entire armies. But for the surviving tankers, this horrific autumn meat grinder remains a deeply personal wound. A wound that will never heal. After a brief, harsh debriefing by the Special Department and 1 week in a chlorine-scented hospital, they are thrown back into the insatiable furnace of the Great War, without the slightest mercy. They receive a new multi-ton combat machine. They once again inhale the nauseating, pervasive smell of gun grease. They return to their heavy, dirty work as if it were routine. Their incredible feat is completely dissolved into thousands of similar bloody episodes of 1941. The military system does not record personal psychological tragedies. It operates exclusively on the dry statistics of destroyed enemy equipment. Far behind, a dead silence reigns. Deep in the German rear, at the battered crossroads of 2 sodden dirt roads, cold autumn rains indifferently wash the black soot from the mangled armor. The hulk of the Soviet heavy tank, twisted by a monstrous internal explosion, is frozen fast into the frozen earth. Around it, in a chaotic semicircle, sit dozens of scorched German combat vehicles. They are rusting rapidly. Heavy turrets have been blown from their rings. Long gun barrels are slumped helplessly into the deep mud. The cursed place no longer holds any strategic significance on the maps of the general staffs. It has turned into a colossal monument to transcendent human resilience, to crushing engineering power. 47 tons of cast armored steel gave their life. They permanently broke the flawlessly functioning clockwork of the enemy offensive. The tank died. The blind physics of its desperate resistance critically altered the flow of time on this sector of the front. The frozen, dead metal holds the eternal memory of the unbearable heat of the fighting compartment, of the sour smell of burnt powder, of the heavy breathing of 5 professionals. The surviving heroes carry the incurable, deep scars of that terrible autumn until the end of their days. The tragedy of any great victory lies in dry mathematics. Its real physical price always many times exceeds any and all initial staff calculations. The crew simply did their job. to the very end, until there was nothing left. Hard,